No, good. I'm going to just move it a little bit to one side. That's all right. We can move it around a little. That's all right. That's a good thing, though. Well, your hair is still going to be in there, but that's all right. You know, that's simply how it is. You're now YouTube famous.
Have you got a pair of scissors?
So we are now streaming live on YouTube. Pretty fancy. So there we go. Thank you one and all.
It's not just for the audience here; it's for millions out there in cyberspace. Isn't it?
Indeed, it is. Indeed, it is.
Okay.
Well, thank you all for coming. Thank you, of course, Jeremy and Anthony, for being willing to give us a bit of chat about Robert Louis Stevenson. I believe you guys have an idea of what you want to talk about already. So, without further ado, give a wee round of applause to welcome you to the shop, and we look forward to having you.
Thank you. Right. Start off with a quick book plug. It's actually not a book plug because it's a nice introduction to what we're talking about tonight. You probably realise by now that the Robert Louis Stevenson Club has at last published Fortunate Voyager, which is a collection of, I suppose you'd call them essays about Stevenson, really sort of personal pieces, not sort of boring essays. They're really, the intention is to show how Stevenson still continues to inspire people today by his various writings, his letters, the story of his life. You know, he's the kind of writer not just that people enjoy reading his books, but they fall in love with as, you know, the whole person. And so there's lots of different takes on why people love Stevenson and why they've been interested in him. Also, why some of their books have been inspired by him. And when we were asking assorted authors to write a piece, I thought immediately, well, Anthony is a connoisseur of horror. He writes of it himself, and he's also a big connoisseur of Jekyll and Hyde. And he first encountered Jekyll and Hyde in slightly unusual circumstances in Adelaide as a young boy.
Melbourne.
Melbourne. Dear God. It's like saying Stevenson came from Glasgow. Oh, God. Things going to get better from here, Anthony.
No, I was very honoured that Jeremy asked me to contribute, obviously, because we're talking about people of the calibre of Ian Rankin and Nicola Sturgeon and Paul McCartney who've contributed to this book. And in the middle of all that is humble me. And I wrote this, about 3 years ago, you asked me?
Yes.
Or so? Yes. So,
it's been a slow cooker, this one.
So this is 2.5 pages, and I've not read this since I wrote it, so you'll forgive me if I stumble occasionally. But this is a very personal recollection from Birdsall. In 1972, my primary school in St Kilda, the Melbourne suburb in Australia, not the Scottish archipelago, opened a library in the top floor of the Gothic church building next door. It survived only a year before going up in flames. Charred pages drifted around the schoolyard for days afterwards. But while it lasted, it represented, for those of us of a bookish nature, with a veritable portal to a world of wonders. Alongside my friend Anthony Chin, now a respectable Melbourne doctor, I regularly bounded up the rickety stairs to embark on my next literary adventure. Years later, the only book I specifically remember borrowing from that ill-fated vault is RLS's Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Owing, I imagine, to the sinister trappings, this title has not been included in the Dean and Son. This title had not been included in the Dean and Sons classics I was already collecting from a local supermarket. So its presence in the school library, complete with lurid illustrations, represented something of a coup, with an added dose of wickedness. Suffice to say, I devoured it. It remains a mystery to me today how an 8-year-old navigated some of Stevenson's ornate prose, such as that which decorates the opening paragraphs, embarrassed in discourse, backward in sentiment, the high pressure of spirits involved in their misdeeds. The two men put the greatest store in these excursions. I inclined to Cain's heresy. Nevertheless, I was so enthralled by the horror of the horror and the textures, and Stevenson was always a master of textures, that I employed my mother to get me a copy of my own. Now, since classic titles were not as freely available in Australian bookstores as they are today, I vividly remember my exhausted mother complaining that she had to walk the streets of Melbourne before she located a copy. And this, to my dismay, turned out to be the heavily compromised Retold by John Kennett edition. I now joke that the original Jekyll and Hyde is so short that the abridged edition is somehow longer. And I happen to have my beloved edition. That's the actual book my mother bore, which I still treasure. A bit like Proust's Madeleine cake. It has this fragrance, did have a fragrance to it anyway, which I used to sniff. I don't know what it is, because it was actually printed, believe it or not, right here in Edinburgh. And I've noticed the pages they used, or the ink, or the binding glue. I don't know what it is, but it has this intoxicating texture. It's just
all Greek.
It disappeared over the years, but yeah, it's unfortunate. But yes, this is still a very much treasured book in my collection. Now, notwithstanding my initial misgivings, it was a volume that quickly became one of my most prized possessions. Odd to say, I was intoxicated even by its fragrance. And it remains on my shelves today, alongside 4 magnificently unabridged editions, some of which I brought along. In fact, I tracked down the edition that I believe was the first edition that I found in the school library. And I also bought another edition a couple of years after that in Melbourne again, from 1898. And this is the book that I was using as a Bible when I wrote my sequel to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which is why, as I was just telling Jeremy, that I called the book The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, when it's actually Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, because that's the way it is.
But Longmans had already started putting them in, which is a common failing among publishers.
Yeah, the definite article. Yeah. It remains on my shelves today, yes, but the story, meanwhile, took deep root in my consciousness and inspired The Lamplighter, my 2003 attempt to imagine a lost book written by an imaginary Robert Louis Stevenson and Arthur Conan Doyle hybrid. And in large part, my eventual move to Edinburgh, where I came here 2 years ago now, where I now reside not far from Stevenson's childhood homes and the site where Jekyll and Hyde, the fragrant John Kennett version, was printed. Even more directly, it resulted in my 2017 novel, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. C, the presumptuous follow-up to the original tale, though I prefer to think that Stevenson was generous enough to write a prequel to my book. In attempting to harmonise my own style and themes, I was forced to deconstruct the original masterwork so thoroughly that I fear I'll never be able to enjoy it again. Ashamed, principally, by my inability to match Stevenson's superbly measured prose and effortless erudition. On the plus side, I did find an opportunity to thank, very belatedly, the lady who contributed so much to my obsession. So while Stevenson dedicated the book to his beloved cousin Catherine de Matos, who played a crucial role in the genesis of the original story, I was able to dedicate my humble offering to my late mother, who walked the streets of Melbourne looking for Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. A fitting tribute, I hope, to parents everywhere who walk an extra mile to instill in their children a love of reading, and to Stevenson, of course. There we go.
Thank you. Right. Jekyll and Hyde. Yes, when it first appeared, it caused a sensation because this was in a pre-Freudian age, and we now have the benefit that readers in those days didn't have. They didn't know, and you don't find out in the story until the end, that Jekyll was Hyde. And this was an absolute bombshell revelation to them at the time, because they didn't know about the id and the alter ego and all the sort of Freudian stuff. And the thought that one person could be two people, and a perfectly nice person could be a perfectly horrible psychopathic killer, came as a huge shock to them. But ever since then, subsequent writers and filmmakers have felt the need, or have been inspired, if you like, to actually change the story, to put new twists on it and all the rest. It's probably a mark of how good a story the original is, that everybody gets excited by it and they think, well, we could maybe do this bit, or we could maybe do that with it, or whatever. But it really has been the gift that keeps giving for filmmakers. I have no idea how many Jekyll and Hyde films there are.
How many good
ones? My favourite of the ones I've seen is Ruin Mammalians one from the 1930s with Frederick March and Miriam Hopkins.
It's the only good one.
Miriam Hopkins is absolutely hot. she had to be, part of her had to be cut out of it originally by the censor, because in the 1930s, having her in bed, dangling her leg provocatively out of the bedclothes was a bit more than they could take. But this takes us on to a bit of an argument, because Anthony goes along with Stevenson's protestations at times that Jekyll and Hyde is not about sex, although you try telling that to Hollywood because they're all being convinced that it is. I think there's only 3 women in Jekyll and Hyde. There's the woman who is Hyde's housekeeper or whatever, that he sort of just encounters utters encounters when he goes to Soho. And she is a very sinister woman, very pale, very dressed up in sort of tarty clothes. I think people familiar with the scenario would have known that she was a brothel madam. And you then have the poor girl, servant girl, who just happens to be looking out of her window on a beautiful evening, or with the moon shining, and witnesses this horrendous murder. And who's the third one? Can't even remember. I mean, there's the servants at Jekyll's house, but there's not really women in the book. So why did Hollywood get the idea that it's all about sex?
Because, and I quote Stevenson here, people, he lamented, are so filled with folly and inverted lust that they can think of nothing but sexuality. Yeah. That's why.
That's why.
Yeah.
Yes.
That the murderous Hyde, he insisted, is no more sexual than another.
Yeah.
Nor did he approve of the contemporary theatrical adaptations of Jekyll that fleshed out his story with love interests and prostitutes.
Right.
His novel is populated almost exclusively with middle-aged bachellers, monastic fellows for whom romance and erotic misadventures are as alien as they would be to Friar Tuck.
So there we go. Was he not trying to have his cake and eat it? He was stirring up people's passion. I mean, people went into characters and said Jekyll and Hyde. The reaction to it was incredible. Is he not sort of stirring up a hornet's nest of sexuality and then denying it at the same time? Which is a very Victorian attitude, if I may say.
Well, last night some learned scholar mentioned that he was, because Stevenson abhorred tacitly D'Urville's, and it was noted that this might be because Henry Thackeray had been. Hardy, sorry. Thomas Hardy. Thomas Hardy was more successful in dealing with sexual issues. It was Henry James, in fact, who blamed Stevenson's sympathy with the juvenile and the feeling about life, which leads him to regard women as so many superfluous girls in a boy's game. As I note, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde was sandwiched between, Treasure Island on one side, and what was the other one on the
afterwards?
Sorry, it's between Treasure Island and Prince Otto on one side, Kidnapped and the Master of Ballantrae on the other. So I think it's at one with those books. I think obviously it's more violent and has a little bit of subtext, but ultimately I think it was intended for the general audience.
There's very few women in Treasure Island.
Mrs. Hawkins. for about 3 sentences.
And Mrs. Silver.
Yes, she gets a mention.
Well, that's it.
Yeah, well, that was for a particular reason, because he allegedly wrote the book for Lloyd Osbourne, his stepson, who was about 9 or 10 or something at the time. And of course, in children's adventure books for boys, they didn't want women in it. They'd spoil the adventure, they'd spoil the fun. So that was perhaps a special case. I would agree. There's not a lot of sex in Treasure Island. There's everything else you could wish for, but there's not a lot of sex in it.
Long Don Silver.
Yeah, well,
this is where
yes, Anthony, in this essay, he has the most bizarre retelling of what various critics have said, trying to find sexual content in the most harmless of titles.
In the books of Jules Verne, which were, yes, I think even more than Stevenson. I was a huge Jules Verne fan as a child, and obviously I bought those classics from the supermarket for 50 cents. But when I grew up, of course, all these annotated editions came out with all these philosophical analyses. And so I was horrified to read that Around the World in 80 Days was an inventive account of human nature involving split personality, repressed memories, neurotic behavior, illicit impulses, sexual obsessions, and many of the concepts that would later be formalized by the psychologists. And Captain Nemo in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, I read, pilots a long throbbing shaft, the Nautilus, and by exposing it to ships, rubbing up against them, or even penetrating them, the captain may be drawing attention to his marvelous machine. And a horror of horrors, The Journey to the Center of the Earth, which was my favorite book as a child. In fact, I'd suggest it's still my favorite book. Where are we? Yes, it abounds with telescopes, trees, giant mushrooms, stick pillars, verticality in general, tubes, pockets, leather wallets, purses, goatskin bottles. The Earth itself is a blatant sexual object with a rich vocabulary to describe the twin, firm, white peaks, pointed waves seething with fire, mouths wide open, gaping orifices, cavities, bays, fjords, gashes, and slits, but also the thrusting and blocking of the most varied penetrations, glows, eruptions, effusions, and discharges. So there we go.
Your mother knows she was buying you this. Indeed. Stevenson, by the way, he as a child, he loved to read Penny Dreadfuls. But Penny Dreadfuls in Victorian times were regarded by Victorian parents as likely to corrupt the morals of their children. They were regarded in the same sort of, reading one of these and you'll end up in the brothels, And there's a lovely little recollection in I can remember Robert Louis Stevenson, the old book that was done in 1920s by the son of John Todd, the shepherd that Stevenson knew in Swanston. And this son found these penny dreadfuls hidden away under a stone house in a field somewhere. And he reckoned it must have been Stevenson hiding them there because he wouldn't dare have them in the house in case his parents knew he was reading this disgraceful filth. So
Hyde, I read, is Jekyll's sexual alter ego. Jekyll is in bondage to him. Hyde, we are reminded, enters Jekyll's residence through the back door. The way to the laboratory.
Too much information.
The way to the laboratory passed through a back passage.
Yes, all right. Okay.
And both Jekyll and Hyde are pederasts.
Right.
Hyde has hairy palms to indicate excessive masturbation. Right. The other gentlemen in the novel are closet homosexuals. Even Sir Danvers Carew, whom Hyde murders in a back alley, was probably propositioning the little monster. His taste in men evidently running to the troglodyte. Yes. There we go. So yes. No, I reject.
I think you're doing a Stevenson. You're saying it's absolutely nothing to do with sex, and you're giving us all this smut and trying to get us all worked up. It's having the effect meeting it.
Who was the critic?
Oh, well, there was various critics. I think for the Jules Verne quotations, I think it was Walter James Miller who did a lot of annotated editions with lengthy introductions, and obviously has a very filthy mind. Yes, but I don't buy it. No. I've got a woman in my sequel, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. C, and I sort of guiltily had something of almost a sex scene in the book.
Yes.
I would say it was bordering on rape. So I went further than Stevenson. So yes. It's
for a modern audience. Right. Right. Okay. Getting back to the original, just for a wee minute. I would contend, yes, there isn't really any overt sex in Jekyll and Hyde, but I think that's the strength. We know that Stevenson wrote version 1. His wife, in 3 days in bed, 30,000 words. He then read it out to his family, his wife and Lloyd and whatever. And Fanny just didn't like it. And he thought, just written this novel story, why didn't you like it? And basically it was too explicit. It just sort of spells everything out. And she said it should have been more of an allegory. And you can think, oh, what a killjoy, why couldn't we see the steamy first draft or whatever? But Stevenson, I think, actually realised she was right. So to avoid just tinkering around with what he's written, he thought he would just throw the whole lot in the fire, which he did. And he then went back to bed and wrote another 30,000 words, which is the version that we know. But the point about it is that its strength is that it leaves so much to your imagination. And actually, people can imagine stuff far worse than Stevenson could have written. One particular example, which is quite shocking. Shortly before Stevenson wrote Jekyll and Hyde, there was a huge expose in the Pall Mall Gazette by its campaigning editor, W.T. Stead. It was an expose of child prostitution, which was sort of the hidden shame of Victorian society. It was going on, but nobody liked it. They all turned a blind eye. But this stuff came out, hundreds and hundreds and thousands of words every day for a week. It was so controversial that I think it was W.H. Smith, certainly the book distributors or the newspaper distributors, refused to handle it. So Stead got the Salvation Army to go out on all the street corners. And there were words said in Parliament. The politicians were desperately trying to stop him because they were blocking a bill to outlaw child prostitution in the Commons. And he said no, and he just basically ran the presses night and day, churning out this stuff. The end result was that all over Britain, people were choking on their breakfast cornflakes and having hysterics and having to go to bed with smelling salts or something because they'd been reading all these terrible, terrible, terrible things that were happening to young girls, which was perfectly true, but they didn't want to think about it. This primed up a whole audience for Jekyll and Hyde, which came out about 2 or 3 months later, because you didn't have to spell out what was going on. You just had to hint, and that would trigger the huge reaction that there's been to this series. And so all he had to do, I don't know what was in his first version, but all he had to do in the second one was to have this picture of Mr. Hyde stumping along the streets at night, an empty streets at night, just about like a juggernaut, he says. And there's this little girl running out on an errand, she's been sent back by her parents or something. And they meet at a crossroads, and Hyde just knocks her down, tramples over her, as if she was just a wee object, hardly even notices he's done it, and tramples her underfoot. And it's a horrific scene, but it's very quick and very casual. And you think, why on earth was he doing, what did you make of this? But if you're talking about Harry, that little child being trampled underfoot by a bad man, this was exactly what the big expose in the newspapers has been about. And Stevenson could plug into stuff like that.
Stead's law led on to Oscar Wilde being put in prison because it was underage sex, wasn't it? And they put in the law. Yeah. Was it 13 or 16?
I don't know how it went. They were.
But entrapped Oscar Wilde.
Yeah. But so Stevenson actually had a knack of sort of touching a nerve in his readers. He had an idea of what was in their head or whatever. And by a wee illusion or a wee something or other, it would sort of trigger it. And so you would imagine all these things. And if Jekyll and Hyde isn't about sex, why is it that Jekyll wants to become Hyde? What can he do as Hyde that he couldn't do as Jekyll without ruining his reputation and probably getting arrested? And really, it's not petty larceny or shoplifting or something like that. It's basically going around brothels, generally having a jolly time, gambling, possibly, all the sort of Victorian vices that you weren't supposed to indulge, that were looked down upon. And but you're not told that. You just have to imagine it. But you pick up, and from the fact that Mr. Hyde has lodgings in Soho, and his housekeeper is obviously a just horrible, disreputable looking woman. Again, people could pick up on what he was talking about.
But kids love these tales. I loved these tales as a kid. I loved Dracula as a kid, which is much more sexualized than Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And I'd say I wasn't responding to the sexuality of the book. I was responding to the architecture or the Gothic atmosphere more than anything.
The Gothic architecture. Yes, you're reading it as a child. I mean, you presumably didn't know about sex, so it didn't really interest you.
No.
Like Lloyd, who didn't want to be women in Treasure Island. What's the point of women? We just want to have a exciting boys' own adventure.
No.
But I always compare Stevenson and Jekyll, his writing in Jekyll and Hyde. It's like somebody getting all worked up, an uptight Victorian, getting all worked up, peering through the keyhole of a room, and they know that something is going on inside that room, but they can't quite see it. They can't get the angle, and so they imagine it. And I think that's what sort of just generates the foreboding and the atmosphere. And there's all sorts of powerful scenes in it. But one of the ones I like is when Utterson gets called to Dr. Jekylls house by Paul the butler in great consternation because there's something strange going on. And he turns up there, and Paul is sort of ashen-faced. The servants are all sort of cowering in the hall, sort of weeping and crying and absolutely terrified. And there's been these strange noises coming out of Dr. Jekylls' cabinet, or laboratory, whatever you like to call it. And, sort of weeping and crying, and it sounded more like an animal. And that is horrific because you're in their position and you don't know what's going on. You're imagining what on earth is in there. And bringing this round, Anthony will talk about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Seek in a minute, but he's also wrote another book called The Devil Upstairs. Originating hilariously on a noisy neighbour upstairs. Nothing more sinister than that. But when Anthony writes about the character in his book and the sounds and the strange goings on upstairs, you imagine all kinds of stuff because he's not really telling what's going on.
Well, I guess you could say I've had. You called me a horror writer before, which I'd say it's not entirely right.
Thriller.
Well,
you want to give people a thrill. You want to.
I've actually had 7 novels published, and most of them have been different genres entirely. But I have written 3 which might be broadly classified as horror, and I think they've all been inspired by Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.
Yeah.
The second book I had published was called The Lamplight, which I just mentioned before, and that's set in Edinburgh in 1886. Tale of the Macabre. It has the devil in it, and I followed that up in 2017 with my sequel to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which again is set in London, even though I think, as Ian Rankin has observed, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is probably it's a quintessential Edinburgh book.
That big, wide, empty street plan at night is the new town. It's got that feel.
Yeah. So in my book, I do have a chapter set in Edinburgh. And my most recent book from a couple of years ago was The Devil Upstairs, which is the first book I've actually written, which is set in the modern day. And it's based on my own experience of coming here to live in Edinburgh 10 years ago. And I should say that I first came here in December 2000. Because I decided to write The Lamplighter and decided to set it in Edinburgh. I've never been here, and I came over here for a couple of weeks and spent a lot of time in the National Library of Scotland, but also just walking around and absorbing the atmospheres and then going to the places where the book is set, like Candlemaker Row and so forth. And I just fell in love with the city. It was just awesome. I wasn't used to the sun going down at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I remember one night in particular, I came out of the National Library of Scotland. It would have been about 4 o'clock. It was completely dark, and there was a heavy fog, and I was just walking through the streets with the. I was thinking, this is just fantastic. So it was those textures, those gothic atmospheres, which I adore more than anything else. I suggest, and I've got to come back here and live just to enjoy those every day of the year, basically. Which is why, even though I'm sure people here who probably lived in Edinburgh all their lives who find it a bit blasé about it, but it's just constantly refreshing to me. Yes, so I came here, my mother passed away, and I had the opportunity to move over here because the Australian dollar was sky high. So I bought a place in Dean Village in a building that's older than any building in Australia, dates from the late 1700s. And it just seemed absolutely perfect to me, and until because I didn't even realise there was another flat upstairs because it's a loft that was turned into a flat, and the person came back from holidays and moved in, and I thought, oh my god, Because you could hear everything. You could hear there's bare floorboards like this. You could hear every creak. You could hear the doors slamming. You could hear him going to the toilet. You could hear him dropping things. And
Like a poltergeist.
yeah, no, it was horrendous. And so I lied there in the middle of the night. And he was also pretty much a party goer. He used to paint the town red, and he'd come back at 3 o'clock in the morning and slam the door and come in and bang, and then the pipes would bang as well. The water pipes would bang. So. Yes, so I found myself lying there dreaming of ways to kill him. As I think people do. This is a horrifying thing. You really wake up in the morning and think, oh my God, I was actually thinking of sticking a rubber tube through the ceiling and pumping poison gas into his flat. And actually putting a tripwire across the stairs so he can come down and trip down and crack his skull open. All these sort of things. No, seriously. And I remember, because I used to work in a warehouse, one of my many menial jobs back in Australia. I worked in a warehouse with some pretty rough characters, and one of them told me a way to blow up somebody's car. And I was actually thinking about doing it. But I think that this is a common thought. I think people, if you could just press a button, I'm sure that there are people here who would just willingly press a button.
It's the dark side of Anthony O'Neil. Your hide could have come roaring out one day and bang.
Did you
ever tell your neighbor?
Well, sort of, because the thing is that in the 10 years that I've been there would have been about 13 different groups of people through there, so in that top flat. So it's not based on any particular person. But certainly when I first moved in, there was a fellow there who's the landlord, who still owns the place, but he's since moved on. I certainly told him. Yes, he hasn't contacted me since. So, but no. So the concept of the book is that this girl is going nuts, and a friend at work. She's from America, and she's adoring living in Edinburgh apart from this very obvious problem. And this Scottish girl at work, who might be a witch, informs her a way to deal with her problem, and that is to go to a sort of a seance where Satan's invoked, and you appeal to Satan to do you a certain favor, and he takes you up on the offer, and that's what happens. The person upstairs is ripped to shreds one night, and she can't work out if this was actually the work of the devil or whether it's she's responsible. And then this other fellow moves in, this new fellow moves in, who is incredibly accommodating and handsome and charming and devilishly handsome, one might say, and she begins to think that he might be the devil. So again, that is sort of inspired by my early reading of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And having said that, there is a sex scene in it. I think I wouldn't say my first sex scene, but yes, there is a sex scene. So yes, I'm guilty.
You're practicing regularly, so right. Going back to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, I was massively impressed when I read it because it spots something that is so absolutely obvious that nobody else seems to have spotted, which is at the end of Jekyll and Hyde. All right, we've been reading all these different separate accounts from separate people that are not necessarily read by anybody else at the time, and when they do get read, they may be read by Utterson, but they're not generally made public. And apart from the Utterson himself, when you check it out, nobody knows that Jekyll is Hyde. All the police know, is that there's a dead body and it looks like Dr. Jekyll. So Dr. Jekyll has been murdered. And they surmise that he's been murdered by this awkward, this terrible Mr. Hyde, who's at large, having murdered the MP. But they never does it cross their mind that Hyde has died at the same time, because they were the same people.
It's the way around, isn't it? So it was the body of Hyde that was discovered, and Dr. Jekyll was missing. So my concept is that 7 years later, Dr. Jekyll comes back, and he's welcomed back because everybody thinks he's just gone missing. He's got this very plausible story about why he went missing. And Utterson is the only one who knows that it can't be Dr. Jekyll. That's right, yeah. Because Jekyll was Hyde.
I'm doing well for Crosswise tonight.
And Hyde was there.
Adelaide and transpose Jekyll and Hyde, right?
Yes. So there we are. So it was a good idea, I must admit.
Did it come to you in a blinding flash? Or,
no, I think it was, again, I was, because I loved the book so much, I thought it would be good to write a sequel. In fact, it's why I wrote the Lamplighters, because I imagined, wouldn't it be fantastic if they found a lost manuscript by Robert Louis Stevenson, and it was a really good one. But I mean, that they found a lost manuscript of Jules Verne, Paris, in the 21st century, and it wasn't very good. But wouldn't it be fantastic if it'd be a huge bestseller and it would be devoured by people like myself? But obviously it's not happening. So you've got to write one yourself. So I wrote The Lamplighter partly as a tribute to Stevenson, as if he'd written this book himself and had just been discovered. So I took that idea a bit further. What if he'd written a sequel to Jekyll and Mr. Hyde? It'd be fantastic. So that's where the concept came from, and it was inspired partly, as I said, by my love of the book, partly just to renew those textures, revive those wonderful textures from the original book, which, as I say, I'm so fascinated, the atmospheres and so forth, which I'm so fascinated with. Having said that, just as an aside, there isn't a great deal of ostentatious atmosphere in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. There are a few paragraphs where he mentions the street lamps and so forth, which are absolutely fantastic. But overall, we've got to remember that he was writing a contemporary book. It was set in his day, so it'd be like if I wrote a book that's set in modern day Edinburgh, it wouldn't be full of atmospheric flourishes necessarily. So, but the atmosphere comes through the incidental detail and the language, the vernacular, and so forth and so on. So that's what I wanted to do, and I wish I had my notes, but I had about 3 or 4 different concepts for the actual plot, and that was the one that I thought was the most promising. So that's the one that I took out.
All marks, all right. You're talking about sort of textures and things, and also I think you're very much into sort of a change of pace in writing. That you write sort of one way and then you change the pace and all that.
Yeah.
Which of course you get in Jekyll and Hyde because you have different narrators and whatever. I thought, having talked about sex, we'll now talk about violence. We've got we witnessed through the eyes of a servant girl who just happens to be looking out an upstairs window the murder of the MP. And for the sake of time, I've sort of said to cut the start bit, but basically the chapter starts off with Stevenson describing this young girl in a very happy mood, very dreamy, romantic mood, all is well with the world, there's full moon shining, everything is absolutely lovely. And then suddenly he cuts to this bit.
Forgive me, my eyes aren't what they used to be. And as she sat, she became aware of the aged and beautiful gentleman with white hair drawing near along the lane, and advancing to meet him another and very small gentleman, to whom at first she paid less attention. When they had come within speech, which was just under the maid's eyes, the older man bowed and accosted the other one with a pretty manner of politeness. It did not seem as if the subject of this address were of great importance. Indeed, from his pointing, it sometimes appeared as if he were only inquiring his way. But the moon shone on his face as he spoke, and the girl was pleased to watch it. It seemed to breathe such an innocent and old-world kindness of disposition, yet with something high, too, as if of a well-founded self-content. Presently her eye wandered to the other, and she was surprised to recognize in him a certain Mr. Hyde, who had once visited her master and for whom she had conceived a dislike. He had in his hand a very heavy cane, with which he was trifling, but he answered never a word and seemed to listen with an ill-contained impatience. And then all of a sudden, he broke out in a great flame of anger, stamping with his foot, brandishing the cane and carrying on, as the maid described it, like a madman. The old gentleman took a step back, with the air of one who was very much surprised and a trifle hurt. And at that, Mr. Hyde broke out of all bounds and clubbed him to the earth. And next moment, with ape-like fury, he was trampling his victim underfoot and hailing down a storm of blows, under which the bones were audibly shattered, and the body jumped upon the roadway. At the horror of these sights and sounds, the maid fainted. So it is unusually violent for the era, isn't it? And unusually effective.
Stevenson just, whenever he was going to have violence, it was very quick. It happened suddenly. And I think he understood that that's what made it shocking. He didn't revel in it, it was just bang, it was happening. The other two really memorable violent scenes to me are when Jim Hawkins is up the mast of his Hispaniola, Israel Hands is coming to get him, the knife flies through the air, Jim is pinned to the shoulder, he can feel the hot blood pouring out of his shoulder where the knife was pinned into the mast. He's got these two pistols in his hand that he's desperately trying to reload. He's got them reloaded, Hands is coming up to get him, and at the last minute the pistols go off and Hands falls off the shrouds into the water. Yeah, welter of blood and foam, and then it slowly clears and he's curled up like a baby sleeping with the fishes. And all that happens in just a few sentences, and that's one of them. The other one, the fight at the roundhouse, Alan Breck is dueling away with all these members of the crew and Mr. Schuon, I think the mate or whatever, trying to sort of come and get him. And of course he's a crack swordsman, and he runs, I think it's with Schuon through, just skewers him on the rapier. And it all happens very quickly, and the next minute the rest of the crew are dragging this guy out by his heels with the blood pouring out of his mouth as he dragged out of the room. And again, it's in 2 or 3 sentences. And Stevenson once said, if I have to kill a man, I kill him good. I think a phrase he got from his wife, his American wife. But, if you're going to have a killing, have a good one.
I think as a writer, it's a very, very difficult thing to do, to change tempo.
Yeah.
And as I was complaining to Jeremy the other day, that I think a lot of very successful, well-reviewed novels these days are written in a monotone. So it's sort of like writing a book so it doesn't clash with the drapes. It's sort of everything is sort of flat. Yeah. There are no peaks and troughs. Mm-hmm. It's just it's like one note from end to end, and I find it very, very boring. Yeah. But it could be just a reaction to the fact that it is very difficult to change tempo in a novel, to suddenly have a burst of action.
But if you want to keep people on seats, if you want to thrill them, excitement, shock them, you've got to do the sort of everything's nice and nice and nice, bang, sort of boom. Yeah.
No, I agree. Books should be enjoyed, most of all.
Just to talk briefly about originals for Jekyll Hyde. Jekyll Hyde has been used as a starting point for filmmakers, novelists, or whatever. But where did Stevenson get the idea from in the first place? Everybody, or the one that is regularly touted, is Deacon Brodie, because of course Deacon Brodie was an Edinburgh bogeyman, and not only that, but he was a cabinet maker, and who eventually got hanged for putting somebody in a raid on the not Customs House, whatever, a building here in Edinburgh, a government building, and he one of his wardrobes that he'd made was actually in Robert Louis Stevenson's bedroom when he was a kid, and he was terrified of this thing. So this great big wardrobe that had been made by the bogeyman. Why his parents left it in there, I think, was very unfair. But the wardrobe, he eventually gave it to his friend Henley when the Stevensons left the UK, and it's now in the Writers' Museum. So you can still see this Deacon Brodie wardrobe that belonged to the Stevensons. And Stevenson also wrote with his friend Henley a play about Deacon Brodie that wasn't altogether successful, although it did get around in the States at one point. But actually having Brodie as the inspiration for Jekyll, I'm not so sure, because the whole thing about Deacon Brodie was he was a bored middle-class guy who wanted to go away to sea and have a life of adventure, and instead his dad said, no, you've got to stay behind and make wardrobes, which wasn't very exciting. And so he used to do things for kicks, and he just liked to steal for kicks. I don't think he was particularly poor, but he would just like to go out, and because he was a locksmith as well, he could take impressions from other people's, from people's keys, which would get in their houses later and rob them. And of course, yes, he had to do it secretly. But he wasn't two different people. He was just a bored guy getting his kicks. Now, if you're talking about a psychopath, sort of two people inhabiting the same body, hardly aware sometimes that of what the other one is, even sort of struggling to sort of suppress one part of your personality. As you get in Jekyll and Hyde, when the transformation starts happening, and Jekyll can't do anything about it, he's had a bit too much of the potion. There's one scene he's at a park, and suddenly his hands start getting a bit sort of hairy and all the rest. And he's terrified, he can't stop this transformation that is initiated. But a psychopath is two different persons inhabiting one body. And Stevenson actually knew somebody like that. There's a guy called Eugene Chantrel. He was French, living in Edinburgh, and he was a French tutor. He gave private French lessons, and also he taught at Newington Academy. And Stevenson, there were several French tutors in Edinburgh at the time, and Stevenson, who used to go to France regularly, used to meet up with them, I think probably to practice his conversational French. It was a good idea if he sort of had a drink in the pub with them, and it would help him along. And so he knew Chantrel sort of. And when Chantrel got arrested for the murder of his wife one New Year, giving her an opium overdose, Stevenson was absolutely shocked and stunned, because he couldn't believe that this perfectly sort of affable, normal guy could have done something like that. Worse than that, Stevenson had just qualified as an advocate, and he attended Chantrel's trial because he knew the guy and he was sort of wanted to know exactly what happened. And because he was an advocate, he was able to chat away to a prosecution team. And they said, we've got a list of murders the length of our arm that we're pretty sure he committed, we just don't have the evidence for it. So he hadn't just killed his wife, he was a serial killer. He bumped off 15 other people in Scotland and down in England before going up to Scotland. And that to me makes him a far better candidate for Jekylls Hydes than even Brody. As to how the story was written, Anthony's mentioned Catherine de Matos. She and Stevenson were both big fans of Edgar Allan Poe. They loved horror writing. And Stevenson had a very bad hemorrhage when he was going down to see Thomas Hardy in the West Country. And they just about got him back in one piece to Bournemouth, to the house there. But he wasn't allowed to speak in the mornings, fear of triggering another hemorrhage. Medical opinion at the time seemed to think that you ought to have complete rest, not even speak. Why it was better in the afternoon, I don't know. And so he was lying there, very bored in bed, having to communicate by writing things on a slate. And Catherine would read him tales by Edgar Allan Poe. So he was having The Raven and, Fall of the House of Usher, all this kind of horrific stuff, Fit the Pendulum, being read to him. And they were loving it, when they were reading it. But of course, when he went to bed at night, it's not surprising that he was dreaming sort of quite vivid dreams after all this. And he then dreamt the dreams that became Jekyll and Hyde. So in some ways, she sort of helped him create the thing. And when he came back from when he had come back from the States with his American wife, Catherine found that Fanny wanted to be her bestest friend. And so Catherine was regularly sort of a visitor at Bournemouth. And they were all getting on very well at the time. But once Stevenson had gone off to the States, there was this almighty row with W.E. Henley, his friend, who was a big, burly, red-bearded guy who only had one leg. Because he had TB, he had to have the other one amputated. And he was the original Long Silver. Stevenson admitted he was the original Long Silver. But there had been a short story that Catherine had written and she couldn't get published. And Henry tried to get it published for her and he couldn't get it published. And then after Stevenson got off to the States, this story suddenly appeared in Scribner's Magazine, which was a big circulation magazine, and it was bylined by Mrs. Robert Louis Stevenson. And Henry was beside himself and wrote to the Stevensons accusing, Stevenson took it as accusing Fanny of plagiarism, of stealing the story. And there was then this huge exchange of letters, getting more and more and more heated, and everybody sort of saying, we didn't want to upset you, but Henry wasn't going to go telling the white lie and say that the story hadn't been stolen, because he believed it had. And if you want to see Stevenson get out Hyde, because he did have a terrible temper. He was, most of the time, he was the most charismatic, lovely person, children's friend. Everybody loved him, not in a sexual way. They just adored him. They loved his work, and they loved to think, they were his friend. They weren't just people who read the stuff. But he did have a very, very violent temper. And although he wasn't physically violent, he could be verbally very, very violent. And this ludicrous argument over whether or not Fanny had stolen Catherine's story reached the sort of simmering point where, reached the point of no return. And this is Stevenson at his very, very worst. I probably shouldn't be reading it on his birthday because it's his unfinest hour. But I think we ought to be having an accurate picture of him. He was lovely except when he wasn't, because he was a human being basically, and he could lose his rag, and he certainly did here. He wrote, and of course he never met Catherine afterwards. It was just letters. So and letters, once you've written them, people could brood over them. They're set in stone. Anyway. Now in the grip of animal rage, like Hyde bludgeoning Sir Danvers carry you to death, he rains down blow upon blow on his one-time childhood sweetheart. I know, and you know, how you have used my wife. I know, and you know, how when this matter came up, you failed me with Henry. I know, and you know, how you wrote an answer. And I know, and you know, how as soon as you had sent the letter off, your heart misgave you. I know, and you know, how I have sought to spare you till today. I now remind you nakedly of the truth. I do not know how to say what I wish to say. There is always a door open. It's never too late to say I have sinned. If not for others, at least for oneself. God knows my heart is heavy enough with my own offences to make me sicken at the thought of seeming harsh, but I counsel you, if you wish peace of mind, to do the right thing, and to do it now. After that, he signed it. Your old friend and cousin, Robert Louis. Catherine had just been given a verbal equivalent of being bludgeoned with Mr. Hyde's heavy walking stick. If this was somebody that you loved, who I think Catherine actually carried a candle from her cousin to her life's end, although she couldn't say so because he'd married somebody else. But to get a letter like that must have been absolutely traumatic.
She's an absolutely fascinating character. I don't understand why there hasn't been a dramatization of her life, because she was there.
If anybody's looking, this could be the basis of a script.
she was there when the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde was first written, and in fact may have inspired it through her own short story. She met Percy Shelley, the son of
Sir Percy Shelley. Yes, he was the son of the poet.
Son of son of Mary Shelley. Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein.
Right.
And she went and lived in Chelsea, where her next door neighbour was Bram Stoker.
Mm-hmm.
And so she's connected to Frankenstein, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and
Dracula.
The three most famous horror stories of the 19th century and probably of all time.
And as I also pointed out, I was looking at the similarities between Catherine wrote a story that's a little bit like Jekyll and Hyde in that it has sort of one person being turned into another. I mean, in her book, it's the scientists taking the personality of one person and sticking them into another body. So you have this sort of scene with quasi-scientists in the laboratory doing something to this something bigger. But it's not only relevant to Jekyll and Hyde, but she was also a friend of H.G. Wells. And if you look at some of the scenes in the time machine, you've got all the sort of mumbo jumbo of how this time machine works and this and that. It's a very sort of similar thing. So whether she was inspired by Stevenson or H.G. Wells was inspired by her, you can go on forever.
She was a literary critic, in her old age.
Stevenson basically helped her to write helped her learn how to write. It was arts journalism, basically. She did book reviews and she reviewed art exhibitions. They were her two fortes. And she would probably get one a week into the Athenaeum. And in those days, when you didn't have TV or other forms of entertainment, if you worked for a big name, classy publication like the Athenaeum, you got paid a fortune. So her one review a week gave her enough money to live on. And Stevenson did help her to do that. he sort of went through her stuff and said, this isn't good enough, well, that's crap, you need to change this, you need to change that. And gradually she got better. And yeah.
Do you want to talk about that other book, it's Treasure Island Tramp, that you've been planning?
Oh, it's not really Jekyll and Hyde. It's I suppose if you've got, like in your book, somebody turning up and claiming to be one person who's
I have very definite ideas about how it should be structured. So, do you want to hear those, or?
Oh, you're going to drag this out. There was a guy who showed up in the 1920s and actually spoke to quite a few of our club members back in the 1920s, including Rosalind Masson, who gave him a grilling and interviewed him because she thought he was a fraud. He was called Robert Stevenson. He was his mother was from Aberdeen. He was born out of wedlock in what's the place called? Foot of the Oakles. My memory is terrible. One of the wee towns in the Millfoots, anyway. And he was born there because his mother had to be taken out of. Well, if you were going to have an illegitimate child, you didn't have it where anybody knew you. You had to go somewhere where you would be known. And he basically had a hellish life. His mother died when he was 18 or 19. He ended up basically being a tramp on the streets and all the rest. But he had this fixed idea that he was Stevenson's son, which he maintained for decades. And he managed to persuade quite a few people of it, including Neil Monroe, the Parahandy stories, and a few others as well. He went down to London. A bloke called Dion Boucicault, who was a famous theatrical presenter or whatever, was doing a production of Treasure Island on stage. And Robert got given us a special box to sit and watch it and all the rest. So people went along with the story, they actually believed it. And
nevertheless, he met Robert Louis Stevenson, did he not?
No.
But wrote to him.
No, he never met Stevenson. He met Catherine Osborne, who was the estranged wife of Lloyd Osborne. But she actually married Lloyd after Stevenson's death. She was a bit of a fake character. She would claim that she would hear messages from Lewis and that she knew a lot about him and what had been going on behind him and all the rest, even though she hadn't been there. Now, whether she'd actually heard this from Lloyd, from her husband, or whether it was fanciful, I don't know. But
nevertheless, his wife parallels the adopted son of Stevenson.
It's a contrast.
The contrast, yeah.
Lloyd Osborne was the spoiled son right from the beginning. Stevenson, I think, did love him. Certainly, he loved Stevenson. There's a lovely scene in one of Lloyd's reminiscences. He wrote a series of reminiscences about Stevenson at different points, and he tells about it was when Stevenson went to Monterey and going for a little walk on the beach. And on the beach, he sort of breaks it to Lloyd that he's going to marry his mum. And how would he feel about that? And of course, Lloyd up until then had been hero worshipping anyway, because Stevenson had a way with kids, they all thought he was great. And Lloyd sort of accepted it, and you have this little bit, they came back hand in hand. So it had a sort of a happy ending there. So no, they were very close. Stevenson got very upset if Lloyd didn't like some of his work. I think it was Weir Curveston he read out one night, and Lloyd didn't say anything. And Stevenson was classing himself. He thought, what's the matter with it? This is my best ever work, and you're just sitting there. Well, for God's sake, say something. If you don't like it, say so, but don't just sit there. Out with it. And Lloyd was just absolutely stunned at how good it was, and it left him speechless. But Stevenson cared very much what Lloyd's opinion on his work. They co-wrote books together.
Nevertheless, it was my very firm opinion that Jeremy's book should be contrasting the two sons the whole of the way through. So you've got
Cain and Abel in your bonnet. You want another Cain and Abel.
Yeah, so you've got the favoured adopted son and the son who is quite convinced that he's the natural born son who isn't so favoured. In fact, he has a very unpleasant tramp-like life. Yeah. If you follow that the whole distance through, I think you've got a winner there. But
if I was writing a novel, yes. The trouble is, if you're writing biography, you try to write it with the vividness of a novel. You use all the information that you can pull together, so that when you write it, it's alive. I mean, bad biographies are the ones that start off with the genealogy of the subject from the year dot, and his grandparents, his great-grandparents, his this, that, the other. It then throws in a whole lot of literary criticism of what people have said about them, and sort of historical this and all that. You don't want that. You want to see the person. You want a sense of who they are and how they behave and all the rest. So in that sense, you can write biography that reads like a novel, or you try to. But I am wary of rock and rolling with the facts just to get Cain and Abel.
But would you rock and roll?
It depends how much money I was on. I would prostitute my art for a lifetime. Yeah.
Well, you would be the first, but as it stands, you for the first half of the book, do you not? You contrast the adopted son with Stevenson.
The way it works really is that for the first part of the book, you've got alternate chapters of Stevenson growing up and the guy who claims to be his son growing up.
So
Very much different backgrounds, but parallels as well. And around about the middle of the book, or slightly afterwards, we reached Stevenson's death. And I thought, well, how are we going to carry on the parallels? Well, there was still Lloyd Osbourne. And Lloyd Osbourne was still very much involved in the story because he inherited the royalties. And he was an absolute stickler for making sure that he got every last penny out of the royalties. The shocking thing I discovered, I can remember Robert Louis Stevenson, that Rosalind Masson wrote with the support of the Stevenson Club in the 1920s. And she got collected all kinds of living memories from people who've known Stevenson. And it's a great read with all these different people remembering what he was like. And she actually got permission from Lloyd Osbourne to use some of his little prefaces that he did for different Stevenson works, just explaining the background, what Stevenson was like in an artist's colony in France, what Stevenson was like in Monterey, all these things. They're quite nice little pieces. And all that was fine. And then there was another piece from Sidney Colvin, who was Stevenson's literary mentor. And in this piece, Sidney Colvin quoted some letters of Stevenson's that hadn't been in the authorized volume of letters. And these were letters to Sidney Colvin. If Stevenson writes you a letter, surely that letter is yours. Oh no, legally, Lloyd Osbourne had the copyrights of everything. He wrote to Rosalind Masson. He insisted that the offending stuff be removed from the second edition. He claimed damages, and he got 500 quid. You could buy a house for 500 quid in those days. It was unbelievable. He just, he was money. And I don't know what he did. I mean, the book itself was quite successful. You can tell that by the number of second-hand copies you can get today. There was a lot printed, isn't there? There are lots of first owners. But I don't think people have made that much money. And I think they were hoping to raise money with it to either purchase Howard Place, Stevenson's birthplace, or to do something with it, turn it into a museum. But the money was all going to be going to do Stevenson-related stuff. And I suspect most, if not all of it, got swallowed up by Lloyd Osbourne. And Robert Stevenson the Tramp, although he's got some elements of the con man about him, and I'm still not convinced of his own claims myself, he's a very likeable,
there we go.
Sympathetically, we figure, whereas Lloyd Osbourne, the favoured son, who ended up with shed loads of money, I'm afraid had a nasty side to his personality.
So you've got an unlikable, wealthy man, and you've got a very likable tramp. You've got to contrast them the whole way through the book. It's very, very pointed. I'm sure everybody agrees with it.
Well, maybe I will.
Not only that, but they were roughly the same age, were they not?
Look, I can't remember when he was born. Robert Stevenson the Tramp was born in 1879. Just after Stevenson had gone to America. It was alleged that Stevenson seduced his mother and then disappeared to the States, and she was left holding the baby, as it were. And then, of course, when he came back, he got a wife. So, what do you do about that?
So there we go. We've settled.
All right, okay. What else are we going to say?
Well,
I've been going all over the place, not necessarily Jekylls Hydes, although quite entertaining.
Jeremy, you said your favourite film version of Jekyll and Hyde, but Anthony never said his.
No, I agree. It was the Frederick March.
It was the Frederick March one.
In which they call Jekyll, which is what Stevenson preferred.
Yes.
So.
I've given up going against the tide, but yes, it's supposed to be Jekyll to rhyme with Treacle. But Jekyll is quite nice because it sounds a bit like Jekyll. It's got a nastier sort of sound to it. So you take your choice. Just about everybody says Dr. Jekyll, unless you're a Stevensonian aficionado or whatever. You can tell this because instead of saying the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, you say strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, because Stevenson wanted it to read like the newspaper headline. You know, after the MP was murdered, you know, strange case of blah blah blah, banner headlines, and yeah. So yes, if you're in the know, Jekyll. If you've given up arguing like me, Jekyll.
Did you ever see the Morecambe and Wise version? Funny as hell. Funny as hell.
Yeah.
Big rubber furry hat.
It's inspired all sorts. There was one that I had to review a while back. It was Julia Roberts and John Malkovich. It was called Mary Riley, and it focused on the one of the servants. And
Actually, no, I actually like
it had a very brooding sort of atmosphere.
Yeah, exactly.
But Malkovich was sort of stumping around like this sort of deformed character. But the good thing about that one was that he didn't get dressed up in a silly monkey suit. The weakest point about the Frederick March one, 4 marks for them to using the same actor, because it's the same person. But when he became Mr. Hyde, he got very hairy, and he had these hilarious sticky out teeth, which weren't horrific at all. They were comedy teeth, you know. But probably because they're the sort of thing that people wear at fancy dress parties today, you know. But
the transformation scenes, though, for 1931 are absolutely astonishing.
Cinematically, it was the way they actually, you know, did it frame by frame.
No.
How did they do it? Right, sorry, I'll agree with them. Yeah.
They did it with dissolves in the Spencer Tracy version.
Yeah.
But in the Frederick March version, they painted him with some sort of liquid, which when they changed the filter on the lights, it turned dark. So no, you can watch it on YouTube, just the transformation scene, and it's quite incredible. I should mention that my abandoned book idea from I worked 8 months ago. I spent about 4 months working on a book in which Count Dracula sues Bram Stoker for defamation. The whole book was going to be set around the court case at the Old Bailey in the 1890s. I thought this was a fantastic idea, and I was even going to make use of Jeremy's book insofar as Catherine de Matos was going to be a witness. Various literary figures at the time were going to make appearances, claiming that you can unconsciously write a character, not realizing that it's based on somebody else. And unfortunately, as part of my research, I read a novel about Bram Stoker, Shadow Play by Joseph O'Connor, which came out a couple of years ago, which is about Bram Stoker managing the Lyceum and writing Dracula. And in the middle of that book, for no apparent reason, a friend of his, sends a gag letter to him, claiming it's from Count Dracula, and Count Dracula is saying, "I'm going to sue you for defamation." And I said, "Oh my God, that's the premise of my book, and it's already been done, so I can't write the book." Jeremy says I should go ahead and do it anyway, but I can't do it.
Well, it wouldn't be a joke letter if you're doing it for real.
I'd be doing it for real, but it's still...
Your job as a novelist is to make it seem real. You know, it's,
but that's right. I think the idea... people would say I'd stole it from there.
Right.
So it's like,
all right. So that one's...
So I put it aside.
That one's in the cutting room floor.
But the amazing thing is, having read an awful lot about Bram Stoker, is that Dracula had virtually no impact when it came out. It was only 30 years later when they did the stage version that suddenly became a phenomenon. Unlike Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which was a phenomenon straight from first printing, wasn't it?
It just took off. It was unbelievable, both here and in the States.
Yeah.
And the classic tale is Stevenson turned up in the States on the Ludgate Hill, which was actually a cattle boat. But he'd been having a great time swilling all this champagne that Henry James had given him, wandering around the ship with all these cows and horses and things, you know, neighing and mooing and all the rest. and he thought this was hilarious. So he had a great time. But when they arrived in New York, somebody had tipped off people that the author of Jekyll and Hyde had arrived. And it was like a film star turning up with huge crowds on the quayside, just wanting to get a glimpse of him. And if you recall John Lennon's remark when the Beatles went to the States, well, he probably wasn't aware of it, but it wasn't original because several decades before then, Stevenson wrote in a letter after this had happened, he said, if Jesus Christ had come, they would have made less fuss.
Wouldn't it be?
He just couldn't understand this behavior. He thought it was bizarre.
Wouldn't it be fantastic to get author today and get that sort of reception?
Yeah.
If Queen Victoria
I could handle it.
Queen Victoria read the book, didn't she?
She read the book, yes. It was seen as a moral tale, and which it wouldn't have been if it had been full of prostitutes and all sorts of naughty goings on. But because there wasn't anything sort of overtly smutty in it, it was seen as a very moral tale because it was sort of, it was an allegory of good and evil, which is what Fanny presumably wanted her husband to write, and it's a success like that. They had preachers, quite prominent preachers. I don't know if it's the Queen's chaplain or whatever, but certainly quite eminent archbishops and whatever were preaching sermons on Jekyll and Hyde. In the pulpit, trying to draw moral lessons from it and all the rest. So it sort of, it was very popular from that side, from the moralistic side. And it was also very popular for the ones who wanted to buy their shilling shock, because it's all about sex in it, really. It triggers the sexual fantasies without actually being together. Can you imagine what it would have been like if Dr. Jekyll had a submarine? I mean,
The newcomers have got no idea what you're talking about.
we had some purple prose where Anthony used to read these classic stories, but with annotations on the bottom by critics who were sort of trying to explain the story. And it would get very, very Freudian, and they would be saying, this submarine in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, or whatever, Captain Nemo's submarine is long and phallic, and all the rest. And you sort of, they got very overheated, didn't they? Yes. So there we go.
Any questions?
Yes. You mentioned earlier about the danger of writing biography and turning it into a novel.
Yeah.
There seems to be recently a lot of novels have come out placing historical characters in them, but actually having them do
some of them are excellent and they're also accurate. Paula, what's her second name? She's done 2 or even 3 novelizations of the life of Hemingway.
Yeah.
God, got a second name. But no, I've read them and they are excellent because they're novels. I mean, they've got a whole lot of dialogue in that Hemingway never said.
Yeah.
But it's the kind of stuff he might have said. She knew enough about him and his personality and the kind of things he would say and all the people that he met that he knew in Paris or whatever, that she could actually reconstruct it. She must have done phenomenal amounts of research.
But do you think that the dividing line between people who just put somebody in a murder mystery or something?
It's a bit tricky. We've got a lady called Annie Bacon, she did a novelisation of the life of David Octavius Hill, the pioneering photographer who worked in Edinburgh and here, there, and everywhere. And she turned that into a novel, and sort of gave his story and his feelings and how he would talk and all the rest, which of course you don't know. And she got that published, and she's now doing one. Stevenson had a, we think, platonic 3-year relationship with a lady called Fanny Sitwell. Platonic because she was married already to an abusive vicar. He was a man we're told of uncongenial habits, which I think means basically he was an alcoholic and got violent when he was drunk. So she was having a hell of a time with this man of the cloth who was, I suppose, in Jekyll and Hyde. We're back to Jekyll and Hyde again, aren't we? Yeah. Where do we go from there? Losing my thread again?
Derail the train of thought.
Derail the train of thought. Who's a happy abusive husband? This is ridiculous. The Alzheimer's is coming. Yes, Fanny Sitwell. And she also had a long-standing understanding with Sidney Colvin. who was keeper of prints at the British Museum, who also wrote for literary magazines. He did reviews and all this kind of stuff. And he taught Stevenson to write much in the same way as Stevenson then taught his cousin Catherine to write. And but Colvin and Fanny Sitwell were actually an item, although they couldn't do anything about it because she was still married. But they had this sort of understanding that when the drunken vicar finally popped his clogs, which he took an awful long time to do, then they would get married, and they did eventually, and she became Lady Colvin. But Stevenson, he met her when he was going through all this terrible upheaval with his parents over his losing his religion and then being deeply shocked because they weren't God-fearing folk. He went off to a family wedding down in Suffolk or Sussex, Cockfield Rectory, and he met Mrs. Sitwell there. And they just entered into this long, passionate correspondence, of which his side survives. But she, being married and not wanting anything compromising coming out, she insisted that he could keep her last letter to her each time, but he must destroy all the rest. And when he got the next letter, he'd have to destroy the one he'd been carrying out of his pocket. And so her letters to him, we have no idea what they're like. But Annie Bacon has thought, this is great. You know, this is you know, you can. There's room to put your imagination into this story there. So she's now doing a novel about Sitwell and Colvin and Stevenson.
Oh no!
And is that another one gone? No, you don't want that one. You'd rather have had Dracula.
I don't like it. I don't like the fashion of doing a book, say, in the style of Arthur Conan Doyle, and then including Arthur Conan Doyle as a character, even the main character. And it's been suggested to me that I should put, the Adventures of Robert Louis Stevenson or something. I don't think it's. I wouldn't do it.
Speaking of which, as a brief aside, I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but Craig Russell won the McIlvenney Prize this year with a book called Hyde. The premise being that there is no Jekyll, only Hyde. But I think Robert Louis Stevenson creeps into that as well, somewhere as a minor character or whatever. So Stevenson is still on the go. If you want to know a bit more, if you go to the Robert Louis Stevenson Day website, rnsa.wordpress.com, you just have to remember the WordPress bit in the middle. He's done a wee video for us talking about the book. His theory is that...
does he live in Scotland? Or?
I'm not quite sure whether he's from Fife originally, whether he still lives up here or not, I don't know. But his theory on Stevenson's inspiration that it was actually Henley who inspired Jekyll and Hyde. Because Stevenson had a sense at the time when they were still friends that Henley could be a bit of a backstabber. Henley, he could be quite bitchy and say bad things about people behind their back. And Henley got increasingly jealous that Stevenson was earning megabucks and becoming hugely famous and Jesus Christ in New York and all the rest. And poor old Henley was sort of struggling to make a few bobbers in journalists in London at the time. So Craig Russell reckons Henley was the model, but I still say Eugene Chantrell, the French psychopath who murdered his wife.
Well, Henley's already the model for a silver, isn't he? So.
Yeah, but why should he have two? You know, it's not fair, is it?
The silver had duality as well.
I just thought that I speak about my three books that were inspired by Robert Louis Stevenson, but there's probably a fourth. They wrote a science fiction novel called The Dark Side, which is set on the dark side of the moon. And in that, there's a Donald Trump-like figure who owns this settlement on the far side of the moon. And he disappears. He goes off to Mars on an exploratory mission. And to look after his city while he's away, he has an android programmed with his business philosophies, which are all very brutal capitalist philosophies. And the android goes mad and follows up on all these little philosophies, and things like to make an omelette, you've got to crack a few skulls and things like that. And so he goes around killing people. Yes, so again, that's obviously a very Stevenson type tale of split personality. Any more questions? Pick up something.
Right. Well, we've rabbited on. We've gone in all kinds of directions, which is probably the best way to do things. it's like buses. If you don't like one, well, there's another one coming along shortly or whatever, or you missed one or whatever. Yeah, but please, live events like this are just on the day. But the Robert Louis Stevenson Day website has quite a lot on it now. I'm always amazed each year how it sort of grows. But there's all sorts of stuff on it, including you can do on catch up. You've got me talking about Lloyd Osbourne's photographs from the South Seas and all these exotic characters that they met on their voyages here, there, and everywhere. So there's that. There's Craig Russell's video. There's Annie Bacon doing a video about it's still a work in progress. She's just done the first version, which she described as a dirty draft. I didn't know that people wrote dirty draft. It sounds absolutely disgusting. But still, you do dirty draft.
Absolutely.
Right. Full of submarines. Yeah. you then have to burn that one and do the clean version. Yeah.
You know what it's like. You just rush through it to get it done, and then you go back and you say, "Oh my God, this is awful." And then you have to clean it up.
Yeah. But no, there's a video of her just talking about Mrs. Sitwell and Colvin and Stevenson. And what else? There's all kinds of things. There's a recipe for making your own Robert Louis Stevenson Day cocktail. Main ingredient, rum. What else we got? It's a role-playing game that the Scottish Book Trust have devised, or somebody there has devised. You can try and Treasure Island is being threatened by a dragon that's arrived in Treasure Island, and you can save Treasure Island from the dragon if you go into this role-playing game. And there's all sorts of other bits and pieces. So if you want to keep continuing RLSA, just go on the website at any time.
Also, if you want to get a free audiobook of Jekylls Hydes, this time last year we were sort of in a bit of a tricky lockdown situation. Various friends of the shop recorded chapters from Jekylls Hydes for Robert Louis Stevenson Day. So the whole thing is available on the YouTube channel, where you will also find the recording of tonight's event. So there we are. Yes. All the technology is there. Well, thank you very much, Jeremy and Anthony, for speaking with us this evening.
Thank you very much for coming along.
Yes, for hosting things.
We do also, of course, have Jeremy and Anthony's books available for sale in the shop. So if you're fancying getting yourself copies and getting things signed, then do feel free.
This rare, hard to get volume.
I've
actually got a copy in my hand here.
There we are. But thank you once again, and I think just like to show our appreciation for Jeremy and Anthony.
Well, that's fun, wasn't it? I think I'm going to hail a passing submarine.